Good morning. This is Paul Lennon with my autobiography for you. Thank you very much for being with me, getting some music going here. And this part of the story is going to be tape number 36 in English and chapter 12 of my autobiography, original version, part F. Almost finished here. And this paragraph was called The Kindness of Strangers. But reflecting on it here, I would say I want to change it to experiencing God's help. I just preached about the Trinity, so it would be experiencing the mercy of God the Father. He's the one who's going to be helping me along the way. And this, for me, is going to be one of my great lessons on God's help coming to me through strangers, you might say, the kindness of strangers. I'm hooked on this phrase of Tennessee Williams because I experienced this in my own personal life. I have a testimony to give. And so afterwards, this will lead me, and it's starting to lead me in a real trusting God. And I've said this later in something I wrote later on, that I was learning to trust God, to really trust God, which I had never learned in the Legion. And I was criticizing again the Legion because I think in the Legion you have all these rules. And so you're trusting the rules and you're trusting your superiors and you're trusting the Legion. But I'm saying you don't really trust God. Because when you're on your own out there in the world, as Neil Diamond's song was saying, you're on the street, you're on your own. Uh, Bob Dylan, like a Rolling Stone. You're really on your own. So you're learning to trust God. This is a beautiful part of my story. And this changed. Somebody has been asking me about this, and I forgot to mention a new spirituality of really trusting God. In this case, now that we're Trinitarians, trusting God the Father. This is wonderful for me. Wonderful. I hope you share some of this with me. I'm going to uh, maybe recap some of this, but it's in the book, so I'm going to talk about this. I was going back to 85. I'm at St. Bart's Rectory. This is my first assignment in the Diocese of Washington. And this lovely lady, I forgot her name, she had an Italian name, Italian Catholic, lovely, actually attractive lady, uh, very religious, wants to help the missionary priest, because then we were supposed to be missionaries. We were supposed to be missionaries, the legionaries, missionaries. But anyway, nice lady. She wanted to, she thought I was kind of lost, and she wanted to help me to know some nice apostolates in the area. And she brought me to this pro-life center. Now, there in the pro-life center, the director of that was a young woman too, a younger woman in her 30s. She was kind of a very serious attitude, this young lady. She was in charge of this pro-life center. And being in charge of a pro-life center in the US of A is not an easy job. You have to have a lot of character. Well, this young lady, we barely introduce ourselves. And then when the other first lady is walking around looking at things, she draws me aside and says, Father, uh, you must be going through a lot of transition uh, from the religious life now to the diocesan priesthood. Huh? I hadn't really realized that. I hadn't seen that clearly. I was in so much turmoil still. And I'm still looking at her, and she says, kind of, don't be, forgive me, but if you like, I'd like to suggest two counselors to you. She must have seen me in pretty bad shape, but very discreetly. And she gave me the names. There. She gave me one card, and one name. And the card was a Marist brother who was a certified Catholic counselor, and the other was uh, a former Jesuit priest, Peter Foley, whom I thought I talked to you about. So anyway, who was I going to choose in my present state of, shall we say, uh, aversion? Oh, that's the Spanish word, I think. This detachment, dislike of all things Catholic in a certain way, or too structured and too hierarchical. So I chose the ex-Jesuit. Okay. Uh, So after a few days, I decided to call the Jesuit. We set up our first appointment. He was going to charge me on a sliding scale, and he was starting out also, as to say, he was putting out his shingle, as the Americans say, in a little. He had rented a room with some nuns or something like that, and that's where we were going to meet. My first formal session, 1985. Sure, April, May, June, maybe of '85. I was. 6 months out of the Legion, or not very long out of the Legion. Uh, he told me a little bit about himself, and he said, I gather that it had not been long since he left the Jesuits, so he was just transitioning now. He must have had a degree in clinical psychology. I think he might have been a spiritual director in the Jesuits, or a counselor in the Jesuits, and now he was making a pretty good transition into the lay, into the world. And he told me, which shocked me very much, that the novice master had invited him to give some talk to the novices so that to help them discern their vocation. Where would that ever happen in the Legion of Christ? You know, what church was this? What order was this? What world was I in here in the U.S. of A? Very lucky to have landed in the Diocese of Washington. It was Catholic. It was middle of the road Catholic, I think, but it was open. Cardinal Hickey was accepting of people, and apparently Washington was a place of a lot of transition. And Peter Foley was just the man that I needed. So he was sitting back there smoking his pipe in his late 30s, I would say. He was younger than me, but better prepared than I was. Hmm. I poured out my soul. I don't know whether I went over the hour. Counselors can be very strict. Maybe I went over the hour. He was helping a fellow priest in crisis. Well, Paul, it seems to me that you have been bouncing off the walls in the Legion of Christ for quite some time. What a summary! A great diagnosis. He didn't go into the DSM-5 or what 4, whatever it was. He didn't go into the clinical. Just very Paul, and this is for some other legionaries. Hear this, fellow legionaries. You have been bouncing off, it seems to me, you have been bouncing off the walls of the Legion of Christ for quite some time. That would summarize it. Maybe the Legion of Christ now was just not the place for me. I was not a good fit. But who was going to tell me that? Who was going to be honest? Why not? Because Paul Lennon and the other Irish guys, I would say, were on the fast track to priestly ordination. So it was all about, don't worry about that temptation. That's a temptation of the devil. Don't worry about that. That you keep going, be strong, trust in God, trusting in Jesus, uh, go before the Blessed Sacrament and talk to Jesus. Didn't help me at that particular time. It might now, but not then. So that was all the help I was getting until this guy kind of opens my eyes and pulls back the curtains and says, Paul, you have been bouncing off the walls maybe for 23 years. God, in the Legion of Christ. Well, thank you, Peter. That was a great help. I gradually realized thereafter that perhaps those doubts of faith that I had from the very beginning were perhaps some obsessive thoughts or ruminations, that those long periods of spiritual drought had been manifestations of dysthymia. Dysthymia is that low-lying depression. And the harrowing bounce of dark nights of the soul, my God. may have been untreated major depressive episodes. Now, how in God's mercy did I pull through that? With the help of God and my own strong Irish, or whatever you want to call it, nature. As they say in Mexican, a puro huevo. I won't translate that. I'll let you read up on it. Just, you know, pull through just with guts, just with guts. So, though depressing the kind of light diagnosis, to think of it, this insight made me grateful to God and boosted my self-esteem, marveling at how I had survived. God, Paul, how are you so strong? Well, had there been too much unnecessary suffering? This is what a person. But yes, you'd suffered too much, da 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 da. And I don't know since when, I never second guess God and his paths and his roads, his tracks and his trails. I don't worry about what would have happened if, why didn't they do, okay, why didn't they help me? I'm becoming Italian now, forgive me. Doesn't matter, okay? I'm here and now. I'm out of there. Praise the Lord. Okay, grateful to God. I never second guess God, but I do question, I'm not stupid, I do question the Legion's care of its members to this very day. No real care. Human, spiritual, pastoral, as the Americans say. They send them, when they're really on the rocks, they send them to psychiatrists who are friends of the Legion or maybe members of the Regnum Christi. So, there again, as they say in Spanish, we always wash our own dirty linen at home. Let's get on. On my getting a job, the second part, briefly here, a few minutes. On my recovery journey, fellow Christians of all denominations embraced me on retreats, invited me to minister, and taught me how to pray. Something else, oh, I should tell you, I can't tell you all the stories I have. Instead of going to the diocesan retreat, because I was kind of allergic to all things Catholic still, I went to an ecumenical center which was wide open. It was run by a former Methodist priest minister and his new wife. So they were pretty open. For the first time in my life, I met Jewish people. I met a female rabbi, for example. I met female Protestant ministers. I met a lovely Episcopal minister, female, who became friends. She helped me. She was much more spiritual than I. She was more solid than I. She's still a minister to this day. Wonderful people. Not they were might have been a few Catholics there too, and it was a retreat about transition, so it kind of fit me perfectly well. I don't know what it was called, maybe Second Journey or Fresh Waters or something like that. The Jesus, the source of living waters, something like that. And we were up there in Kirkridge, in the mountains of Pennsylvania, in a forest almost. So it was a beautiful setting to to be open to try to hear the voice of God and to meditate on sacred scripture in a very non-threatening way. Thank you very much. Kirkwood, highly recommended. And then, at the end, I'm talking about here 85 to 89. When 89 came, I'm just showing you, I said goodbye to my parishioners at St. Matthew's. I think it was during a Sunday Mass. And what happened? They stood up and applauded me because I was anxious, I was afraid, I was cautious, I was a little bit ashamed maybe. They stood up and applauded me when I explained that I had to take my leave of absence. Maybe because I was being honest, I wasn't hiding under a rock. Affirmation, my God. Father, God bless you, and I hope you have a good transition. Very affirming, God. That's the loving Church of God, the loving Catholic Church. Thank you. Wonderful. Then I had Monsignor Gerhardt who helped me go through all the paperwork to get my dispensations. Then I started looking for a job, which was very threatening to me. That transition into the world, don't forget it, lads and ladies and lassies, as the Scottish would say, um, girls and boys, uh, stepping out of the priesthood. That's another reason why we don't leave very often. That's very often why we hang on to the priesthood, because that stepping out into the world without the supports, without a roof over your head, number one, without food necessarily being on your table, without having your cook in the kitchen, without having the other lady washing your clothes, and without getting your monthly stipend from the Archdiocese of Washington. Very scary. So I had to look for the job, and I was a 45-year-old man, single, which was not a really. It was a kind of like that could have been a what do they call it, a red flag to the whole counseling profession. They'd be wondering what was this guy doing for the last 25 years of his life. Had he no life experience? And in some cases, I didn't want to tell them I had been a priest. Maybe some of them may have suspected it, but in the United States, they don't ask you these kind of questions. There, people are very respectful of your boundaries. Now, they are the real boundaries. They're professional boundaries. But anyway, Nancy Chesney, Fairfax Adult Education, helped this disoriented 40-something-year-old with an MA and no experience. I had no postmaster's experience. This is what your experience before it. Very few people will accept that. You have no postmaster's experience and you're 45 years old. And you're trying to explain what you have been doing in those 44. Gradually you might say, "Oh, hey, I was a missionary in Mexico." Now that is not scary. That is not shameful in the United States. Oh yes, Father, you must have really loved those people, and how generous you were to go down to meet to work with those less fortunate families. They thought I was a real missionary, out in the out in the rainforests, which I did actually, being a missionary in Quintana Roo, Cancun, so forth, Yucatan. Yes, gave me a certain cachet, because yeah, I at least among many I had been a real missionary. The Americans just take it with normality. Anyway, Nancy Chesney didn't know who the heck I was, this Irish-born American citizen. Part-time as what was it, English as a second language. In the beginning, I may have had like 4 hours a week, which was four by what? I remember I was earning $56 a week, which was 200 and so dollars a month there. I didn't have money to pay the rent. I started getting in debt with my credit cards and bank and everything. That's another story which I will not burden you with, but thank you, Nest. Then I got a job. The first kind of professional job I got was really low on the ladder. I owe nothing to nobody. Excuse me. Low, starting from the bottom up. It was a detox, substance abuse detox center, also part time. Thank you very much. I wasn't earning very much there either. Then I got after a year or so, I don't know when, 1990, 89, 90, I got my first real job at Northern Virginia Family Services. Thank you very much, Ann Wood. was the person who trusted me in a first time job. And I was working. She was trusting me. This old fogey uh, enabled me to work with my beloved Hispanic community. But I worked first time. It was not so clinical. Yeah, I worked as a uh, outreach worker in a poor Spanish community in the Culmore area, Bailey's Crossroads. And I was like a housing counselor, and I did some little counseling, and I worked with the local elementary and high school. And then finally, after that, I got my first real clinical job when Diana Manganelli trusted me, this bilingual Irish born Caucasian, with a job in Arlington County Human Services. And that's what I got my first real job at. The second time uh, I had health insurance, very important in the United States. And that is where I really began my counseling career. That is when I really began to learn a lot and to enjoy being a mental health therapist with a decent salary. And by that time, I had my housing. I was renting an apartment in Arlington. So I was starting to make my way. Ends were starting to meet down there. Thank you.